Two men stepped onto the porch, clipboards in hand, their smiles polished and rehearsed. "Routine inspection," one said, glancing at the gate as if it were already his. They saw only an elderly woman living alone in a quiet Iowa town no one seemed to care about. She didn't argue. She took note. 3 nights later, they returned, this time without clipboards. What they didn't know was that the woman they targeted had a son trained in places where justice was claimed, not asked. For when Ethan Harris returned and read her final message, the town's silence broke and the reckoning quietly began. Before we go further, comment where in the world you're reading from, and make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. The soil along the porch steps always needed extra coaxing. The earth was packed tight, shaded by the overhang, as if reluctant to yield without reassurance. Yet even there, beneath the stubborn weight of clay and shadow, Eleanor Harris knelt with the quiet patience of someone who knew how to wait. Her knees rested on a faded blue pad she'd cut from an old chair cushion years ago, settling into place with the familiar grace of ritual. She worked with slow hands, fingers pressing gently into the dirt, turning it over, loosening it just enough to breathe. She didn't speak, didn't hum, not today. She only listened to the hush of wind across the garden fence and the distant chirp of sparrows nesting in the maple trees by the road. The air carried the scent of damp soil and fresh grass, not yet burned by the full Midwest summer sun. As she leaned back to wipe her brow with the sleeve of her sweater, Eleanor's eyes settled on a small cluster of rosebuds tucked low in the rosebush. They'd been slow to bloom this year, and she'd worried the late frost had claimed them entirely. But now at last they were opening. Pale pink, edged with white, curling shyly toward the light, as if something sacred had endured the cold. She studied them for a long moment before standing slowly, her back stiff, her weight shifting cautiously, as her joints reminded her that nothing moved as easily as it once had. She dusted her palms against her apron, the gray fabric smudged with soil and rosemary, then stepped carefully onto the porch and reached for the phone she'd left charging just inside the screen door. Her glasses waited beside the charger, always in the same spot so she wouldn't misplace them. Slipping them on, she opened the camera, angled the phone toward the roses, and snapped a picture from just the right angle, framing the porch's edge and the warm light falling across the wood like memory itself had come to sit beside her. With practiced fingers, she tapped the message field and typed slowly, adding a heart before hitting send. Roses finally came in. "Wish you were here to see it, sweetheart." Miles away, beneath a different sun, Ethan Harris sat on the edge of a narrow cot inside a steel-walled bunker where names were replaced with numbers, and silence was the only language, spoken with trust. His boots rested in the dirt, worn from a terrain that didn't belong to him. The laces were streaked with dust that clung to everything, uniforms, weapons, skin, and never truly washed off. The mission was done, the final sweep complete, yet none of them moved with ease. Around him, the others packed gear with robotic focus, checking weapons and zipping bags without conversation. A silence forged not from calm, but from exhaustion, buried under discipline. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on knees, scrolling absently through the cracked screen of his phone, the glass smudged with the dirt of the last 12 hours. 3 messages. One from command with encrypted debrief coordinates, another from a fellow operative about heading stateside, and the third from her. He tapped it without thinking. The image took its time, buffering on a weak signal until the roses bloomed into view. His mother had centered the blossoms in the frame, soft pink petals folded like quiet prayers, with a sliver of the porch railing casting a diagonal line through the background. Below the photo, her message sat quietly, waiting for acknowledgement. He read it twice. A faint smile pressed into the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. He started to type something back, then stopped. A shout echoed down the corridor, his name called sharply, urgently. He pocketed the phone and stood, slinging his pack over one shoulder with the reflex of muscle memory, not emotion. He told himself he'd reply after wheels up, after the dust settled, after the next round of silence. Back in the kitchen, Eleanor set the phone down on the counter, her glasses beside it, then reached for the kettle and moved with slow precision. Through her morning routine. One tea bag into her favorite cup, the one with the chipped rim and faded daisies along the edge. One cube of sugar. One hand pressed lightly to the Bible that remained open near the windowsill. The kettle clicked, off, steam rising in curls as she poured, her gaze drifting through the kitchen window that framed the gravel road beyond her yard. Across the street, a white utility truck had pulled just past the maple trees marking the boundary of her land, its engine humming low, steady, too deliberate to be casual. She narrowed her eyes, watching without leaning too far forward, and waited. No one got out. No one moved. The engine purred, then stopped. Still holding the kettle, she stepped away from the window and let the curtain fall gently back into place. Her breath was slow but shallow now, as if the unease that had settled over the town had finally seeped through her screen door. Something was wrong, not loud, not sudden, just wrong, like a house grown unfamiliar despite never changing. She stirred her tea and set the spoon down perfectly straight on the saucer. Her hands moved from habit, not hunger. Her lips parted, in a quiet breath, the edges of a prayer forming silently in her chest, not yet spoken. Outside, the first breeze of morning brushed against the new blooms, swaying the roses gently, as if trying to call her back to them. Inside, the air stilled, and far from home, Ethan walked into a new assignment, unaware that the last message his mother sent would be the one he'd never answer. Lately, there had been a feeling Eleanor couldn't quite name, something humming beneath the stillness of her street, subtle but insistent, like a note held too long in the wrong key. The days moved the same, the birds still nested in the maple trees, and the mail still came at 11. But something in the rhythm of the neighborhood had shifted. Conversations with neighbors grew shorter, more watchful. The couple down the road had started parking their truck across their driveway instead of beside it, angled deliberately toward the street like a barrier. Young men she didn't recognize rode through on bicycles at odd hours, never waving, never looking her way. It wasn't a loud change, but it was present, steady, like the chill before a storm that hasn't yet touched the ground. The sound came just after noon. 3 sharp knocks, quick and clipped, no hesitation between them. Eleanor had been in the den folding linens with the radio humming low, a preacher's voice trailing into a hymn she didn't quite know. She paused, hands resting on a warm towel fresh from the dryer, and turned toward the front of the house. The knocks came again, softer but still clear, not the kind of knock that belonged to a neighbor or the mailman. She walked slowly, not out of fear, but because life had taught her to look carefully before rushing to meet anything. The screen door creaked as she pushed it open, and through the glass, she saw them. 2 men in matching orange safety vests and plain gray caps, standing just off the steps with clipboards in hand, their smiles practiced and neighborly. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had taken punches in another life. The other was leaner, wiry, with pale eyes that didn't quite settle in one place. They stood a little too straight, as if rehearsed, their ease making her bones tighten. "Afternoon, ma'am," the taller one said, tipping his cap slightly. "Sorry to bother you. We're with County Utilities. Got a report about a possible power irregularity on this line, maybe some surging, flickering lights, outages." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked past them to the truck parked at the curve in the road. No logo, just a plain white cab and a rusted bumper. "My light's been fine," she said finally, her voice calm but flat. "Ain't had no flickering." The wiry one smiled wider. "Could be upstream. Hard to say. We're doing meter reads in the area, making sure things line up before we roll a bigger crew out. Mind if we have a look around back? Won't be long." Her hand tightened slightly on the doorframe. She didn't step back, didn't open the screen. "You don't usually need to look in people's backyards to read a meter." The tall one laughed softly, holding up the clipboard like it proved something. "It's a new process, pre-inspection. We won't touch anything. Promise." Eleanor kept her eyes on him. His hands were clean, no calluses, no dust, the kind that hadn't done real outdoor work. "What's your name?" she asked. The man blinked. "I'm Rob, this here's Kenny." "And your ID?" she said, already knowing the answer. The wiry one, Kenny, shifted slightly. "Oh, we don't usually carry—" "Then I don't usually—" "Open my gate," she said, and began to close the door. The taller one held up a hand, not quite touching the screen but close enough to make her pause. "Ma'am, we understand. Lot of scams going around, sure, but we're legit." He reached slowly into his vest pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it against the glass. "Here's the inspection request. Came through dispatch this morning." She stared at the paper but didn't reach for it. "I'll call the office myself if I need confirmation," she said, voice low. The tall man nodded. "Of course. We'll move on to the next. No trouble." They stepped back in unison. Their movements fluid, too clean, like they'd trained for this moment. Eleanor watched them return to the truck. They didn't rush, didn't speak, just got in, started the engine and drove off without turning around. She didn't move until the sound of gravel faded completely. When she returned to the den, the linen on the chair had cooled. She sat slowly, one hand resting on her knee, the other picking up the notepad she kept beside the phone for grocery lists and sermon quotes. She wrote down the time, their names, their descriptions, and the color of the truck. She circled the words "no ID" twice, then underlined them. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the porch light clicked on, she made a cup of tea and stood by the front window, watching the road. The breeze had gone still, and even the sparrows were quiet. She didn't feel fear. She'd lived too long, seen too much to give herself over to that. But unease had settled inside her house like dust along the baseboards. She took her phone, opened the message thread with Ethan, and typed slowly. 2 men came today, said they were from the power company. No ID. Said something about checking. The line. I didn't let them in. Just thought I should tell you. She hovered over the send button, reread the message, then hit it. The screen blinked, confirming delivery. No read receipt, just the gray check mark. And silence. Far away, Ethan was beneath fluorescent lights in a makeshift debrief tent, his phone silenced in the side pocket of his gear bag, forgotten in the rhythm of orders and names, none of which included hers. Eleanor placed the phone face down on the counter and locked every door in the house, double-checking the back door twice. In her room, she placed her notepad beside the Bible, folded her sweater at the edge of the bed, and lay, down fully clothed, the faintest flicker of tension behind her eyes. In the quiet, she whispered another prayer, this one wordless, just the steady hope that someone, somewhere was listening. The days stretched uneventful, the way danger often does before it breaks open, silent, patient, waiting for something to let its weight be felt. Eleanor kept to her routine, though her eyes lingered longer on the windows now, and her walks to the mailbox grew slower, more deliberate, her head turning gently as she scanned the street with an attention she hadn't needed in years. Her neighbors didn't seem to notice. Mr. Thompson mowed his yard on Saturday, as always. Mrs. Larson waved from her porch swing, her terrier curled beside her like nothing had shifted. But Eleanor knew better. Something in the air had changed, a stillness before a heavy wind. It was on the 3rd night after the first visit, just past 10, long after the porch light flicked on and the street went quiet, that she heard them again. This time, no knock. It began with the crunch of gravel near the side fence, not loud but purposeful. She'd been sitting in her bedroom, her Bible open on her lap, rereading a passage in Psalms about deliverance, her glasses balanced low on her nose. The sound pulled her upright. Her breath caught before her body moved. She didn't turn on. The light, she knew better than to give herself away with shadow. Instead, she rose slowly, her bare feet silent against the floorboards, and moved to the edge of the curtain by the side window. In the pale glow of the porch light, she saw them. Same 2 men. No safety vests this time, no clipboards, no smiles. The taller one walked along the side of the house with a flashlight angled low, as if pretending to check something. The wiry one lingered near the back gate, his head tilted like he was listening. Neither spoke. They moved like they'd already made up their minds. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. No service, just the spinning circle of a failed connection and the quiet realization that she might be standing alone in more ways than one. The men began, circling. They didn't come to the door. didn't bother with pretenses. The flashlight passed by her kitchen window, paused, then moved again. A rattle came from the back gate latch, metal against metal, soft, but insistent. She backed away from the window, moved through the darkened hallway toward the kitchen, stopping, just long enough to retrieve her notepad from the counter and tuck it under her arm like a shield. In the living room, she flicked off the last light. Only the small lamp beside the hallway remained glowing, and she turned that off too. The house sank into darkness. The rattling stopped, replaced by a different sound, the soft scrape of something metal dragging lightly across glass. She tightened her grip on the phone. Still no signal. She remembered the old landline buried in the hall closet behind her sewing things, disconnected years ago. She cursed under her breath and moved instead to the bedroom, reaching for the photograph of Ethan that stood beside her alarm clock, him in uniform, standing straight in front of a row of tents, the same slight tilt of the mouth that never quite became a smile. She clutched it tightly. She didn't cry. She sat on the edge of her bed and whispered a prayer, this time not just for strength or wisdom, but for time, for delay, for whoever was outside to find nothing worth continuing. Outside, the flashlight moved past her bedroom window once more, slower, like a question being asked. Then, footsteps, gravel shifting again, quieter, retreating. They were leaving. She didn't move until she heard the engine start. The headlights never came on. The truck backed down the road with its lights off, disappearing around the corner like something slipping beneath water. She stayed where she was for a long time, her hands folded tightly around the photograph, her eyes open, unfocused. It was nearly 2 in the morning before she stood again, crept to the window, and peeked out one last time. Nothing. She walked to the kitchen in silence and wrote everything down. The time, the route they took around the house, the gate latch, the flashlight, the lack of vests, their expressions. She wrote it all as if documenting the last hours of something sacred, as if writing could protect her. She didn't send Ethan another message. She told herself he was busy, that he'd read the last one, that he'd call when he could. Far from home, Ethan crouched in the shadow of a cargo bay, his rifle slung low, dirt caked across his cheek and collar as the plane vibrated under him. Extraction was coming. He could hear the idle chatter of other soldiers, low, clipped, the way people talk after a job they don't want to remember. His body ached from the sprint, the drag, the fire. His hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, brushing the phone, but not pulling it out. There would be time later. For now, the mission wasn't over. Back home, Eleanor folded her notepad closed, placed it beneath her Bible, and lay down once more. She left the lamp off. She didn't undress. She pulled the covers to her chin and closed her eyes. The photo of her son stayed on the pillow beside her, and somewhere outside, beyond the still curtains and the silvered glow of moonlight on glass, the night breathed quietly, watchful, waiting. It came not as a surprise, but as confirmation. Proof that what had crept through her bones was real. No longer a shadow, but a shape taking form in the late afternoon light. The sun slanted low across the porch where Eleanor sat in silence, her tea untouched on the arm of the chair, her sweater, sleeves pulled down to her wrists despite the warmth. The roses near her feet had bloomed fully now, their petals thick with color, fragile in the way only things born too late in the season tend to be. Her hands rested in her lap atop her notepad, though she hadn't written anything since morning. She simply watched the road. The truck came back, same make, same rusted bumper, now with a magnetic sign clumsily affixed to the side panel, County Power Services, the letters peeling at the edges. The ruse was worse than before, too clean, too sudden, like a costume worn by someone who didn't know the part. The two men stepped out as if summoned by the street's silence. Their uniforms were neater, pressed with effort, but no knowledge. One held a clipboard again, raised like a flag of harmless intention, while the other's hands were empty, relaxed at his sides, though his knuckles flexed with an energy that didn't belong to an honest worker. Eleanor didn't stand. She waited. "Afternoon again, ma'am," the tall one called, his voice too cheerful, too wide to be natural. Apologies again. Brought the proper paperwork this time. Just want to drop it off and finish our check. Won't take long, she said. Nothing. Her gaze drifted to the truck, then the sidewalk, then the garden hose curled loosely by the porch steps. We've got a request from dispatch. Real formal this time, the wiry one added, lifting the clipboard as if it erased memory. Thought you'd appreciate that. Should clear up any confusion. Her fingers tightened slightly around the notepad, but she didn't reach for the cane beside her. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but unwavering. I told you once already. This house don't need checking. You can leave your paper on the step. Totally understandable, said the tall one, nodding, stepping forward in a manner that seemed casual but wasn't. We'll leave it right here and be on our way. He mounted the steps too quickly. She pushed herself up from the chair. The second man moved around the side of the porch as if to circle her, and something in Eleanor's chest folded inward, her body knowing before her mind could fully articulate it. She reached for the door. Too late. The first man surged forward, driving his shoulder into the screen before she could close it, the door snapping open with a sound that split the air. Wood cracked, the latch gave, and their weight entered her space before she could catch her breath. She cried out and staggered back, catching the doorframe with one hand while swinging the notepad with the other. It struck the man's face with the weight of desperation, not force, and fell to the floor without a sound. The tall one cursed under his breath, shoved her backward, and caught her arm just below the shoulder, as if he'd done this before, as if he knew where to grab and how tightly. Stay still, he muttered. She tried to twist away, her elbow jabbing toward his ribs, her cane forgotten near the porch. The wiry one slipped through the side door, now ajar from the force of their entry, and together they cornered her in the narrow hallway, pinning her between the wall and the kitchen threshold. She fought with the strength of someone who knew that giving in meant no second chance. She clawed at their faces, tore at their shirt buttons, and screamed, a high, ragged sound that grew louder the more they tried to silence it. Her nails left red marks. Her voice rose again. Get out of my house, she shouted even as they pushed her into the dining room table, sending framed photographs clattering to the floor. We ain't here to steal, the wiry one said through gritted teeth, not even hiding the contempt in his voice. Just cleaning up what should have been cleared out already. This is my home, she rasped, reaching for the drawer by the kitchen counter. The taller man slammed it shut before she could open it. Not for long. They dragged her across the room, her feet kicking over the rug, knocking aside the small wooden stand that had once held her Bible. She swung wildly at the thinner man, catching his chin. He struck her back, hard, across the cheek. Her knees buckled. She fell, not crumpled, but on purpose, reaching for the floor lamp behind her. The blow came down again. Outside, a neighbor across the street paused mid-step, groceries hanging from her arm. She looked toward the house. A scream, a scuffle, the porch in disarray. But then she turned, eyes lowered, hurrying inside with her head bowed. The curtain slid closed. Inside, the flower vase shattered. Water spread across the hardwood, soaking into the rug, washing against the corners of family pictures, now scattered and broken. One photo landed face up. Ethan, young, unformed, smiling faintly in the sunlight. Eleanor tried to reach for it. The tall man's boot came down on her wrist. She bit her lip to keep from crying out again, her body still resisting, refusing to yield to the bruising weight of their assault. Even as their force overwhelmed the space around her, the sharp pain radiating through her limbs didn't stop her from trying to twist away, nor did the blood trailing from her temples silence the voice in her that told her to fight until her last breath. Her fingers reached instinctively toward the floor, toward the glimmer of her phone half hidden beneath the armchair, as if its familiar weight might still offer a chance to be heard, to reach someone before it was too late. But as her fingertips brushed the device, the taller man caught her wrist and slammed it against the floor with such force that the pain ricocheted through her shoulder, her vision blurring at the edges. The phone skidded further out of reach, disappearing beneath the chair in a scrape of plastic and silence. Still, Eleanor refused to stay down. Her elbow flared up toward the man's ribs, connecting with a dull thud that made him grunt, not from injury, but from surprise. His reaction was immediate and vicious. He grabbed her sweater's collar and dragged her roughly across the floor, her heels scraping against the rug, the fibers catching her slippers as she struggled to find footing, to anchor herself against, the force pulling her from everything she knew. Her hand swung wildly, catching the edge of a photo frame on the table, sending it crashing to the ground. She tried to cry out again, but the sound tangled in her throat as the taller man shoved her against the base of the couch. Her ribs struck the wood with a heavy crack, and her breath vanished. Her body sagged for a moment, but not from surrender. She was gathering what little strength she had left. "My son," she rasped, voice gritty with pain, rising from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "My son's military. He's trained. He'll come back and find out what you did." There was no hesitation in her voice, no wavering plea, only the unflinching truth of a mother who believed in the man she'd raised, clinging to the hope that speaking his name might stop what was already in motion. But the taller man looked down at her, unmoved, his face expressionless as he crouched beside her. So close she could feel the heat of his breath against her cheek. The stink of cigarettes and sweat made her eyes water, but she didn't look away. "Lady," he said, his tone void of care. "You think anybody out here gives a damn who your boy is? He ain't here now, is he? And when we're done, he won't. Find nothing worth coming back for." He stood and pressed his knee into her lower back, forcing her face into the rug as he turned his head toward the hallway. "Take whatever looks good," he called out. "Clean it out." The wiry man, already halfway through her bedroom, responded with a careless laugh that carried no real amusement, only the thrill of control. He rummaged through her drawers, tearing open the lining of her jewelry box, his boots stomping through the delicate folds of scarves she'd worn to church. When he opened her closet, he ripped dresses from hangers as if punishing the fabric for belonging to someone proud. "Not much here," he called back, his voice echoing faintly through the walls. "Just costume jewelry and some old coins. Grab it anyway. She won't miss it," the taller one replied, still holding Eleanor down, his weight making it nearly impossible to draw a breath. Her chest rose and fell in short, trembling bursts as she tried to move again, to twist her body just enough to shift the balance, to make them underestimate her one last time. She reached blindly toward the couch leg, trying to pull herself forward inch by inch, but the effort only made her body scream louder in protest. Her arms trembled, her legs useless from the strikes she'd taken. She could see the corner of Ethan's photograph now, its frame cracked from the struggle but still intact, lying just within reach on the floor. She stretched toward it, not because it would stop them, not because it held any magic, but because it was his. And in the absence of his voice, his arms, or his footsteps on the porch, it was the only part of him she had left to hold on to. The wiry one returned from the hallway with a bag half full of her belongings, photo albums, a pair of small kitchen appliances, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and the little metal box she'd kept at the back of the pantry for emergencies. He glanced down at her as he passed. "She's still moving?" he asked flatly. The taller man didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, staring at her face as her eyes blinked slowly, barely holding focus. "She's almost done," he muttered, his voice stripped of anything human. Then in one final motion, he drew back and slammed his fist into her chest with a force that came not from impulse, but from decision. Eleanor gasped. Her body jerked once. The wiry man dropped the bag on the couch and reached for the broken leg of a chair that had splintered near the entryway. "Just finish it," he said. "She ain't worth jail time." He walked away before it happened. One step, then another, and behind him, the dull sound of wood striking flesh echoed once, twice, then no more. Outside, the porch light flickered, slightly in the wind, casting long shadows over the crushed roses now torn and wilted beneath boot prints. A few petals clung to the air, carried briefly across the yard before landing silently in the gravel. Across the street, behind a drawn curtain, a neighbor peeked out once, saw the truck parked in the driveway, saw the flickering light, saw the stillness that followed, then pulled the curtain shut without a word. Inside, the house settled. The silence that came after was not peace, nor sleep. It was erasure. Eleanor lay motionless on the living room floor, her blood seeping into the rug's fibers, her hand still reaching toward the photo of her son that lay face up beside her elbow, untouched but faintly smeared with red. Under the armchair, her phone lit up once, vibrating softly as a call came through. The name on the screen pulsed. Ethan Harris. But she did not reach for it, and no one else would. The call failed to connect. Somewhere across the ocean, Ethan glanced at his phone during the final minutes of debrief, his hands calloused from the operation, his body sore from the weight of armor, and long nights crouched behind silence and orders. The name on the screen flickered, Mama, then vanished before he could unlock it. He frowned slightly, assuming a dropped signal or a missed check-in. His team leader called his name, pulling him back into the noise of wrapping up, and like so many things in war, the message slipped into the backlog of what he'd get to later. But something about the missed call stayed with him, a knot that didn't settle in his gut, the kind that doesn't make a sound but doesn't leave either. By the time they boarded the extraction flight, the sky had dimmed. The base faded beneath them and the wheels lifted into that gray space where past and present blur. Ethan sat by the window, eyes unfocused, as he finally opened his messages. Her last text. Roses finally came in. Wish you were here to see it, sweetheart, had gone unanswered. The next, short and urgent, 2 men came today. Said they were from the power company, no ID. I didn't let them in. Just thought I should tell you. Had never been read. He reread it twice, checked the timestamp. The air in his chest thinned. He didn't wait for wheels to touch the ground. He called home from the layover. No answer. He called again when they landed. Nothing. Then he called the church. The pastor didn't answer, but the voice that did was trembling. That was how he found out. Not from his commanding officer, not from a red-stamped report, not even from a neighbor, but from a junior secretary at the church office who stammered through the words as gently as she could, telling him the funeral had already happened, that it had been sudden, that arrangements had been made quickly, and everything had been taken care of. Ethan didn't ask what that meant. He ended the call and rented the first car he could find. Oh. Dusty gray sedan with a faulty air conditioner and a half-full tank. The drive home passed in fragments, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. The roads both familiar and alien, the kind that never change but feel wrong when something's been taken from them. The late summer heat hung heavy through the windshield, and the gravel roads leading to the house curled like veins through a land that no longer felt like it belonged to anyone. When he pulled into the driveway, it wasn't the sight of the house. That struck him first. It was the absence. The porch where she used to sit with her tea and sweater was bare. The garden beds she'd tended with quiet devotion were stripped. The roses were nowhere to be seen. A single weed grew through the stone where the hose used to coil. The windows were closed, blinds drawn, the screen door crooked on its hinge, like someone had opened it too quickly and never fixed it. The front door was unlocked. Ethan pushed it open slowly, and the air smelled faintly of bleach, dust, and something gone. The walls were wiped clean. The floor was swept. Everything looked arranged by people who knew nothing of the woman who once moved through this space with care and purpose. The family photos were missing. The Bible was gone from the side table. The radio no longer played the gospel station. Her gray sweater, always draped on the couch's edge, was gone, replaced by nothing but the ghost of habit. On the kitchen counter sat a folder with his name on it, taped shut as if that made anything right. He peeled it open. The documents were thin, clinical, devoid of meaning. The sheriff's report called it a robbery gone wrong. No suspects detained, no witnesses came forward. No known leads, no reason to suspect anything but opportunistic crime. The scene had been secured. Valuables removed for inventory, though no inventory was enclosed. The wounds were mentioned in passing. Minor contusions, evidence of struggle. Unfortunate fatality, as if her life mattered only as much as a broken window or a smashed clock. The autopsy was worse. 1 page, cold language, cause of death, blunt force trauma, notes, deceased found with defensive injuries consistent with resisting assault. No mention of time of death, no detail about the house's state, No evidence. Gathered. No photographs. No apology. There had been a funeral, the papers said, held quietly with a few congregation members, arranged by the church board. Closed casket, quick burial. Cemetery records showed the plot was donated. Her body had been put in the ground without him. He stood in the living room center, folder in hand, and looked around at the hollow shape of what had been a home. The couch cushions were different. The rug was gone. The lamp was replaced. Even the clock on the wall ticked a new rhythm, louder, out of place, like it was hung by someone who just needed the room to look full again. He crossed to the corner, where her chair always sat, and knelt, brushing his fingers along the hardwood as if expecting to feel her presence. But the floor was clean, too clean, bleached of everything, even memory. He stood slowly and walked outside. Across the street, someone pulled a curtain closed. Down the block, a car door shut, then restarted its engine without pause. He walked house to house, knocking, calm and deliberate, his presence enough to stir discomfort. 2 neighbors answered. One mumbled sympathy. The other said they didn't want to get involved. The rest didn't open their doors. By the time he returned to the porch, the sun had nearly set. He stood there, one hand on the splintered rail, eyes locked on the driveway where the tire tracks had never been brushed away. That night, he slept on the living room floor beside the folder and the empty side table, facing the spot where his picture once stood. He didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He lay still, eyes open, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it did, he rose too. Not as a son mourning a mother, but as a soldier returning to a war that had come home in his absence. The morning light filtered slowly through the window panes, draping across the floor in streaks of pale gold that didn't warm the space so much as illuminate its emptiness. The living room, stripped of photographs and memory, sat untouched since the previous day, its hollow quiet interrupted only by the subtle groan of the house settling under the weight of something that no longer lived there. Ethan remained still for several minutes after waking, lying flat on his back in the room's center, eyes fixed on the ceiling, arms resting loosely at his sides. The same position he'd fallen into when night took him, not from sleep, but from exhaustion and restraint. There was no plan in those early hours, only a choice. He stood slowly, joints stiff from the hardwood, and moved through the house, not as a visitor but as someone reclaiming what had been taken. His mother's bedroom was as cold and cleared as the rest. Her closet door was slightly ajar, revealing only hangers and a box of church hats stacked like forgotten crowns. Ethan opened the old cedar trunk at the foot of her bed and found it mostly empty, save for a folded flag from his father's funeral and a stack of letters wrapped in twine, their corners yellowed and soft with age. He didn't touch them, not yet. By late morning, he drove into town in the same rental sedan, its interior warm from the sun and faintly scented with cracked leather and old pine air freshener. He didn't stop at the store or pass through the church. He drove straight to the sheriff's department, pulling into a half-full parking lot where the flag on the pole barely stirred in the breeze. The office was modest. 3 desks, 2 filing cabinets, and a corkboard wall with notices no one had read in weeks. The woman at the front desk greeted him with a practiced smile that faltered when she recognized his name, gesturing toward the back office. Sheriff Wyatt Colton emerged a minute later, the creak of his belt audible as he adjusted it over his hips, his thumb hooked casually beneath the leather like he had nowhere else to be. He didn't extend a hand or offer condolences. His tone was flat, rehearsed. "Figured you'd turn up eventually," he said, leaning against the doorframe like a man who'd answered these questions before and didn't expect to again. Ethan held the folder under his arm, its contents unchanged, infuriatingly blank. "You want to tell me why your report reads like someone broke a window? Not a body?" The sheriff exhaled through his nose, a gesture both tired and mildly annoyed. "We did what we could with what we had. No signs of forced entry. No hard evidence of a struggle beyond what we documented. The place was disturbed before we got there. No cameras in the area. No reliable witnesses. We logged it, processed the scene, wrote it up. Sometimes these things happen." "She didn't just fall down, Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice low, each word controlled. "She fought." "Yeah," Colton replied with a shrug. "Old folks usually do. Doesn't change much in the end. Ethan didn't blink. You found her with bruises, broken ribs, blood on the rug, and you logged that as a routine robbery. The sheriff tilted his head, still leaning comfortably. Like I said, no suspects. No one saw anything. We've got 2 deputies and 50 miles of county to cover. Unless someone wants to talk, there's not much we can do. I've seen it before. You stick around long enough, you'll see it too. Someone's seen something, Ethan replied, his voice harder now, though it never rose. Colton pushed off the frame, adjusted his hat, and glanced toward the hallway. You can check in with me if you hear anything yourself, but I'd suggest letting the dust settle. Stirring things up won't bring her back. Ethan stared at him long enough for the silence to stretch uncomfortably, then turned and walked out without another word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't look back. He stepped into the afternoon heat and walked through it like it had no hold on him. The rest of the day passed with steady clarity. He visited each house on the block, knocking with patience, listening to the scrape of curtains and the slow click of locks behind doors that once welcomed his mother with pies and polite conversation. Some opened halfway. A few didn't open at all. The words offered, if any, were hollow, crafted to say nothing of value. One neighbor spoke of how kind she'd been. Another said it was a shame. A third said it was the world they lived in now, as if that excused everything. By dusk, Ethan returned home with nothing useful. No names, no faces, no confessions, just the tightness in his chest growing heavier with each unopened door. He walked through the house slowly, pausing in each room to scan the walls, corners, windows. He pulled down the attic stairs, climbed into the dry heat of the crawl space, and found the old footlocker she'd kept behind holiday boxes and worn luggage. The lock was old, but not rusted. He opened it and stared at what remained of a past life he'd tried to forget. A combat knife, clean and sharp, a flashlight, a utility belt, civilian gear that looked like it had been left for someone who'd one day return. He ran his hands over each piece, checking for wear, then laid them out on the bed in the room that no longer felt like his mother's but hadn't yet become his. He didn't eat that night. He didn't speak. He only prepared. By the time the moon rose high over the yard and the breeze rustled the weeds where her garden once stood, Ethan was walking the length of the backyard, his boots silent on the soft earth. The flashlight beam cut through the dark like a needle. Careful and precise, the knife clipped to his belt, not drawn, not brandished, but waiting. He moved through the property line and into the trees, scanning the woods with a hunter's stillness, following the fence that separated his family's land from the empty fields beyond. This wasn't grief. This was war, and the first step had been taken. The road out of town curled through the woods like a lazy question, lined with cracked pavement and overgrown ditches, a place that hadn't seen repaving in years, but carried the secrets of those who used it after dark. Ethan's truck, an old matte black F-150 he'd traded his rental for in cash from a man who didn't ask why, moved without sound beneath him. The windows were down, the engine kept low. He wasn't driving fast. Speed was for people who didn't know what they were looking for. Ethan did. He'd spent the last 3 days listening, not just to people, though that offered nothing, but to patterns, truck schedules, gas station chatter, bar deliveries, empty stretches of road that saw movement at night. It was in a conversation, outside a bait shop, between 2 men who didn't realize he was parked close enough to hear, that he caught the detail that mattered. Someone had bragged about cleaning out another one of those places, and someone else laughed, saying that one didn't go easy. They didn't say her name. They didn't have to. The bar was a rusted low-ceiling shack pressed against the woods just off a forgotten side road, where the neon lights outside barely flickered, and the parking lot was gravel-stained with engine oil and cigarette ash. It sat like a wound left to fester, attracting men who worked without licenses, paid in cash, and bragged too loudly when they thought no one important was listening. Ethan didn't go in. He waited in the truck, one hand on the steering wheel, the other holding the tattered notebook he'd begun filling with names, descriptions, license plates, anything that moved wrong, looked wrong, or stood too close to memory. When he saw the man step out just after 11, beer in one hand, phone in the other, Ethan didn't need confirmation. He knew by the posture, the relaxed yet tense way the man carried himself, as if reliving something that made him feel powerful. His gait matched the footage Ethan had recovered from a backlot security camera at a feed store down the block from his mother's street. Grainy, low quality, but enough to catch the signature limp and heavy left heel. The man leaned against a concrete pillar at the lot's edge, lighting a cigarette with a plastic lighter, exhaling slowly into the humid night air, unaware he was being watched. Ethan didn't rush. He waited until the man walked toward the truck parked at the lot's end, keys jingling from a belt loop. Then he moved, slipping out of the driver's seat, boots silent over gravel, the darkness folding around him like a second skin. He caught, up near the truck bed, his shadow long and quiet until he was close enough to smell the alcohol on the man's breath and the dust in his shirt's folds. "You left something behind," Ethan said. The man turned, confused, then wary. Then something sharper. "I don't know you," he said, taking a half step back, his hand moving toward his waistband. Ethan didn't give him the chance. The first blow landed clean against his gut, folding him forward without sound. The second came across his jaw, sending him sprawling sideways into the truck bed. The cigarette flew from his fingers, the lighter clattering to the ground. Before the man could recover, Ethan closed the distance, grabbed his shirt collar and slammed him against the tailgate with a force that echoed into the trees. "You were at her house," Ethan said. The man gasped, one arm flailing, the other, reaching behind for something Ethan had already taken, a folding knife now lying useless on the gravel. "I don't know what you're—" Ethan drove his knee into the man's ribs with surgical precision, controlled, trained to rupture without killing. The man screamed, tried to twist away, but Ethan's forearm pressed against his throat, pinning him like a board beneath weight. "Her name was Eleanor Harris. You remember her now?" "I don't. I swear to God." Ethan pressed harder. Not enough to cut air entirely. Just enough to remind him lies wouldn't last long out. "Here, you and your partner wore vests, no IDs. You knew she was alone. I wasn't there. I just heard—" The second rib snapped under pressure, and the man howled, slumping under Ethan's grip. "She was my mother," Ethan said, voice quiet, eyes unflinching. "So you're going to tell me everything you know, every name, every place, and you're going to do it before I stop asking nicely." The man coughed hard, blood trailing from his mouth, his bravado gone, replaced by something sharper than fear. Guilt, not for what happened, but for surviving it and now facing someone who'd come to collect. "There's a warehouse," he choked out, eyes squinting in pain. "Off Route 9 behind the feed silos, old grain depot. They meet there sometimes, stash stuff, wait out heat when something goes wrong." "Who's they?" "Don't know. All the names. Just Clay runs it. Clay Barger. He picks targets, sends boys to pose as workers, says old folks make the least noise." Ethan pressed slightly harder, just long enough to make the man squirm, then released him. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his ribs, his face drawn with pain and shame. "How many others?" Ethan asked. The man didn't look up. "At least 3 I know of, maybe more. Most don't fight back." Ethan stared down at him. For a long moment, the moonlight casting lines across the gravel. His shadow stretched behind him like something separate. "Get up," he said finally. The man struggled to his feet, still hunched, wheezing. "If I see you again," Ethan continued, "if I hear your name tied to another house, another body, there won't be questions next time. Just silence." Stepped back, let the man stumble toward his truck, then turned and walked away without glancing back. The trees took him in as he moved to his own truck, the gravel whispering beneath his boots, the blood on his knuckles drying in the night air. He didn't need to write anything down. Every name was carved into his memory, and now he had a place. The warehouse stood at the edge of nowhere, nestled behind rusted silos and a bend in the road no one used unless they had business worth hiding. It was the kind of place where silence was the language, where the rust on the steel siding deepened like a scar too old to matter. No signage, no lighting, no visible cameras, just a half-hung chain on the gate and recent tire tracks. Ethan didn't park at the gate. He left his truck a mile down, concealed under an oak-lined ditch behind trees thick enough to swallow headlights. He moved on foot, the early morning air cool enough to keep his breath shallow, his steps measured in the quiet cadence of someone trained to arrive, pass through, and leave only memory behind. When he reached the side entrance, the lock offered no challenge. He opened it with a twist and stepped into the dark with the control of a man who didn't need light to see clearly. What greeted him was cold order, rows of crates, makeshift shelving lined with bags, boxes, folded goods, and plastic bins labeled with counties and dates. The air smelled of plastic, old paper, dust, with an undertone of oil and mildew, like someone tried to clean a place that remembered every crime it sheltered. He walked slowly between aisles, not looking for confrontation, only confirmation. A stack of ceramic figurines caught his eye, most chipped, some shattered. A box of kitchen tools, mostly dull, lay open beside it. Then, beneath a warped table piled with costume jewelry and small electronics, he saw something that stopped him. Her glasses. The left lens still bore the faint hairline crack from when she dropped them 2 winters ago. The earpiece had the same pink tinge, faded but unmistakable. He picked them up gently, turning them over in his hand, his breath quiet but uneven. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He closed his fist around them and slid them into his jacket pocket without ceremony. Then he poured the gasoline, no hesitation as he marked every aisle, every crate, every shelf holding pieces of lives stripped from homes like hers. He moved without anger. Anger was for people with time to burn. Ethan only had time to ensure no one else mistook this place for anything less than a burial ground. He lit the match just after sunrise. The fire didn't roar. It crept, growing quietly, feeding on wood, cardboard, photographs, half-folded receipts, and old furniture legs. Then it caught fully and consumed. He was gone before the roof cracked inward. The smoke spread fast. The fire department arrived late, and by the time they did, the blaze had taken everything. No alarms triggered, no witnesses lingered. But those meant to see the message saw it, felt it, and some panicked. By mid-afternoon, word moved through the network. Some called it bad luck, others called it retaliation. But one man didn't wait to see which it was. Ree, a low-level runner known for pickups, drop-offs, and quiet sales, disappeared by sunset. He didn't tell anyone, didn't return home, just packed a duffel bag with what cash he could grab and walked to the county bus depot, hoodie pulled low, posture stiff with paranoia. He checked over his shoulder 5 times before reaching the curb. Ethan had been there for an hour, watching from a nearby bench, eyes on the gate, the lot, the vending machines buzzing under pale yellow lighting. He didn't know Ree's name. He didn't need to. He recognized the instinct. Men who vanish too quickly have stories worth bleeding. When Ree stepped past the second bench, Ethan stood and followed in silence, closing the distance as the man turned to fumble with a coin for the soda machine. The hit wasn't fast. It was exact. Ethan struck the back of Ree's knee with his boot, driving his weight through the joint, sending the man crumpling forward with a howl that echoed across the lot. Before Ree could roll or recover, Ethan grabbed his jacket front and slammed him into the depot wall, one elbow driving into his ribs with surgical force that cracked something vital inside. Ree tried to scream again, but Ethan's hand pressed against his throat, not crushing, just reminding him how easy it would be. "I don't care who you are," Ethan said, voice calm, words like stone. "But I know what you're running from." Ree tried to reply, but Ethan drove his fist into the man's stomach, forcing the air out before he could speak. "You know, the warehouse," Ethan continued, not asking but stating. "You were close enough to run, close enough to fear." Ree coughed blood, nodded quickly, his hand shaking as he tried to lift it in defense. "I didn't do nothing to her, man. I swear, I just handled drops, that's all I ever did." Ethan grabbed him by the collar, lifted him halfway to standing, then spun and threw him across the pavement, letting him skid against the concrete with the sound of denim tearing and skin scraping. "Where's Clay?" Ethan asked, walking toward him slowly, methodically, as Ree scrambled backward against the bench, trying to push himself upright on a broken leg that no longer held weight. "He's got a place," Ree gasped, eyes wide, spit mixing with blood on his chin. Out near Miller's Creek, farmhouse behind a burned-out field. No phone lines, no Wi-Fi. Says it keeps him clean. Security. 2 guys, maybe off-duty types, but he doesn't trust them much. Keeps records, real logs, names, payouts. Tracks people. Old folks on retirement, single homes, places easy to clean. Ethan said nothing. He stood over him for a long moment, watching as Ree writhed, one hand clutching his knee, the other reaching for nothing. "You're done," Ethan said, voice quiet, not a threat, but truth. "If I see you again, I'll finish what I started." He turned, walked away from the depot without looking back, and disappeared into the night as quickly as he'd come. The man had given him everything he needed, a name, a location, and the evidence to burn it all down again. The sun hadn't risen in 3 towns before Ethan's name became something no one dared speak aloud. Not because they knew it, but because they feared what came with silence. He didn't arrive like a storm. He moved like a system, slow, exact, methodical in his ruin. No social media posts marked his presence. No news articles chronicled his violence. There were no warnings, no trails, no confessions, just broken men, quiet disappearances, and an unspoken certainty that someone was tearing through the gang, from the inside out. It started with a man named Cutter, a tool runner. Stolen drills, saws, equipment taken from garages left cracked open at night. He thought he'd gotten out clean after the warehouse fire, thought the heat would die down if he kept his head low. But Ethan found him behind a pawn shop in Alton, stepping out with a bag of merchandise tagged from 3 counties. He didn't approach with rage, silence, his steps measured, shoulders relaxed, not from peace but certainty. Cutter noticed too late. Ethan drove him face first into the trunk of his own car. By the time Cutter reached for the weapon beneath his shirt, Ethan had dislocated his shoulder with a snap that echoed through the alley, then forced him to the ground with a knee against his neck. The questions came low, clear, expecting answers, because the alternative was already measured. Ethan didn't need a name. He needed the pipeline, meeting spots, collection houses. Cutter, choking on blood and snot, gave up everything in under 10 minutes. Ethan took photos of the trunk's contents: pill bottles, fake IDs, a folder of elderly homeowners with notes: widowed, no security, garden tools visible, easy entry. He didn't call the police. He left Cutter cuffed to the iron fence behind the pawn shop and disappeared into the night. The next was Mace, a small-town enforcer who fancied himself tougher than he was, handling cash drop-offs. Ethan found him at a roadside bar east of Hollow Ridge, mouthing off to a waitress who'd told him twice she wasn't interested. Ethan waited until he staggered out to relieve himself behind the dumpsters, then grabbed his collar, spun him, and delivered 3 calculated blows to the abdomen, and 1 across the throat, not enough to crush the trachea but enough to drop him flat. Mace didn't talk until his left wrist bent the wrong way, and even then he tried to posture. Ethan didn't indulge him. He forced Mace to recite names, payment cycles, planned hits, and who they'd paid off in the last 6 months to keep patrols away from certain neighborhoods. Then he took a photo of Mace's busted face, documented the money transfers on a burner phone from Mace's pocket, and erased the rest. Mace was found 2 hours later tied to a park bench with a note taped to his chest. "This is for the quiet ones, for the ones you thought no one would miss." The message spread, not on paper, not online, but through coded calls, encrypted threads, whispered warnings behind car windows. Each man taken wasn't just wounded, he was emptied, made to relive every act he thought would never find consequence, every home he'd violated, every face he'd laughed at on the way out. The bodies didn't pile up. Ethan wasn't reckless, not a murderer, but a reckoning, one that took its time. Back in the hills, in a farmhouse behind a field of wild grass and dying fence posts, Clay Barger watched his operation fray in real time. He sat in a dark den, laptop open, a digital map on the screen lit with markers that once meant revenue and now meant risk. Clay considered himself smart, smarter than the brutes he hired, the police who barely blinked at reports, the system that made his enterprise possible. He'd planned his network with precision, chosen victims with logic, stayed distant enough to keep his hands technically clean. But this pattern was different. Not police work, not a rival turf war. The hits were too clean, too exact, too personal. Whoever was moving through his crew wasn't sending a message to the organization, he was sending it to him. Clay clicked through a photo he'd received that morning. Mace, bloodied, hand splinted crudely, eyes swollen shut. The message on, his chest, the quiet ones, caught his attention. He sat back, fingers steepled, the room empty of sound. That phrase meant something. He opened a file cabinet beneath the desk, rifled through folders until he found the address. Old lady on the edge of town. Eleanor Harris, solo occupant, minimal security, payout marginal, but clean. He remembered the house, the silence that followed. The report said she fought back. It also said she had a son. His fingers paused. He stared at the name for a long moment, then closed the drawer. The silence he'd counted on to protect him was gone. And somewhere beyond his land, Ethan was already on his way, moving through the fields with the quiet discipline of someone who'd planned this, not out of rage, but purpose. He wasn't chasing vengeance or burning things to feel alive. He was finishing a list, and Clay had just realized his name was on it. The warehouse fire didn't make the news, but the smoke reached City Hall. Not through reporters or police. Reports, but through anxious backroom whispers when systems built on silence began to crack. Someone had burned a supply hub to the ground. Someone had crippled half a crew without leaving a body. Someone was asking questions in places that had stayed unanswered for years. Sheriff Wyatt Colton heard it first from a town councilman who issued a concern, a polite observation about rising tensions and an outsider making rounds. The sheriff didn't miss the warning behind the words. When he asked what the council wanted him to do, they didn't answer directly. They didn't have to. Quiet was the goal. As long as the town stayed still on paper, everything could be managed. But Colton was no fool. He knew the fire wasn't a coincidence, just like he knew the men turning up bruised, bloodied, or vanished hadn't been mugged. It took little effort to trace the timeline, less to realize the man who hadn't left town since the funeral, whose truck now appeared regularly outside a home that should have been sold, wasn't just grieving, he was hunting. So Colton started, asking around, not using Ethan's name at first, just describing a former military type asking too many questions. He kept the tone casual, a passing curiosity, but the answers made it clear it was too late. Neighbors had seen him, bars had noticed him, none had stopped him, not because they supported him, but because they were afraid. By week's end, Colton drove out himself, parking in front of Eleanor Harris's home just after dusk, stepping out with his hat tucked low and his belt heavier than usual. He didn't approach with authority, but as a man who'd read the report and knew he hadn't done enough. Ethan opened the door before he knocked, his look not angry but worse, precise, cold, measured. "You need to leave town," Colton said without wasting time. "This place is getting smaller and people are noticing." Ethan leaned against the frame, one hand just out of sight. "You noticed when they killed her?" he asked, voice. Calm Colton didn't answer. "You take down any plates, collect any statements, or did you file that one straight into the drawer and wait for the dirt to cover it?" Colton sighed, his boots shifting against the gravel. "What you're doing, it's not justice." "I'm not looking for justice," Ethan said, voice flat. "I'm looking for facts. I understand you're angry." "No," Ethan said, eyes narrowing. "Angry was 3 weeks ago. This is something else." Colton adjusted his hat, looked past Ethan into the dark house, and nodded once. "You've made your point," he said quietly. "Now let it be." Ethan didn't reply. He closed the door. Later that night, when the town went quiet, when the sheriff's cruiser returned to its lot and the station's lights flickered under tired wiring, Ethan came back, not as a visitor or citizen, but as a ghost. He moved through the alley behind the sheriff's office with the ease of someone who'd studied every camera angle, timed every patrol car, mapped the lock rotation on the back gate. The door gave after 3 seconds. The inner hallway was dark, the desk lamp on by a deputy too tired to finish the shift. Ethan slipped past the front room into the records office and closed the door behind him. The filing cabinets were old, labeled by year. He ignored the digital terminal. Better not to trust a system with a delete key. What he needed was on paper, buried, because someone wanted it forgotten, not removed. In the drawer marked 2023, Miskey Complaints, he found her. Name, Eleanor Harris. 4 entries, 3 phone calls, 1 walk-in. Descriptions in brief. Possible trespassers posing as utility workers. Unmarked vehicle parked near property multiple times. Unknown individuals knocking after dark. Each stamped with the same outcome. No further action required. No follow-ups. No interviews, no photographs, no notes. Ethan read them twice, laid them on the desk beside the faded station calendar. He opened another folder labeled Internal Complaints. 1 entry stood out, handwritten, dated months earlier, mentioning multiple calls from the same street, elderly residents reporting strangers watching their homes. 1 deputy's name was circled 3 times in red ink. Ethan took a photo of each page, sliding them back into their folders exactly as they were. No fingerprints, no scratches, no mess. He didn't want to raise alarms. He wanted them to sleep through the realization of what he'd taken until it was too late. When he returned home, he laid the photos out on the floor. His mother had called, not in panic or confusion, but with the clarity of someone who knew the difference between something feeling wrong and being wrong. She'd reported what she saw: unmarked trucks lingering too long, unfamiliar men in reflective vests knocking without reason, the unsettling stillness that followed when she turned them away. She'd trusted her voice on record would mean something to those supposed to listen. The reports weren't imagined. They were written in pen, dated, then filed away in drawers never opened to follow through. She'd reached for help and been logged and forgotten. The failure wasn't from ignorance. It was a decision, a deliberate choice to treat her concerns as unworthy of urgency, to dismiss her as one more aging voice on a street the town decided didn't matter. The truth sat in Ethan's hands now. Photographs of complaints, transcripts of ignored warnings, a complete absence of action from men who had every chance to do the smallest thing that might have saved her life. They hadn't just failed her by inaction. They'd erased her by design, excusing their silence with language that buried countless others before her. Ethan sat on the floor for a long while, surrounded by the weight of paper that should have protected her. The soft lamplight casting tired shadows across the pages and hardwood. The room, once hers, carried absence in every corner. The chair where she read, the window she cracked open when the weather turned, the hallway she walked. With quiet strength long after her body slowed, none offered comfort now, but the facts, stamped, signed, buried, gave structure to the rage, names to the silence, reason to the storm building inside him. It didn't ease the grief or offer peace, but it replaced the blur of what-ifs with a sharper edge, one that cut clean, not with vengeance, but clarity. There were more names now, more men hiding behind distance, badges, and backroom handshakes, more voices that chose to stay still while hers was silenced. In the long stretch of night, Ethan no longer carried uncertainty. What he held was colder, heavier, more dangerous. The knowledge that everything she feared was real, everything she warned about was true, and every soul who could have stopped it did nothing. Not because they couldn't, but because they never intended to. What lay ahead wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about balance. Every step from this moment would be measured with the precision of someone with nothing left to lose. The field behind Miller's Creek was quiet, as forgotten places often are. Long grass whispering under the wind, fence posts leaning like tired old men, the smell of damp earth rising like breath from a hidden mouth. Ethan stood at the field's edge, boots sinking slightly into the soil, looking across the wide plain toward the house sitting crookedly against the tree line. The farmhouse wasn't much. 1-story, tin roof, shutters half-hinged, windows clouded with dust. But it had the air of something wrong, something buried beneath the floorboards waiting to be dug up. He didn't sneak in. He walked, each step slow, deliberate, his breath even, the rifle strapped across his back untouched. This wasn't a Mission or a siege, it was quieter, older. The last page of a long chapter written in names, silence, and blood. As he crossed the final stretch of grass, he saw Clay Barger step out from the house's side. No guards, no panic, just a man holding a cigarette, stance casual, eyes unreadable. He wore a faded jacket, collar frayed, boots scuffed and unlaced, like he hadn't planned to leave even if he could. Behind him, the cellar door stood open, a dark mouth yawning beneath the porch steps, the faint glint of metal shelving below, records likely, or weapons, or whatever. Clay was too arrogant to burn. Clay didn't speak at first. He took a slow drag, exhaling smoke like a man who thought he still had the advantage. "I heard about Ree," he said. "Heard about the warehouse. You've been busy." Ethan stopped 10 feet away, hands at his sides, shoulders loose. He didn't answer. Clay nodded slightly as if expecting that. "Look," he said, "I don't blame you. She was your mother. I get it. You want someone to answer for what happened. But this..." He gestured around at the empty land. Sagging. Porch, broken path leading nowhere. This was never personal. It was just business, just easy. Ethan didn't move. Clay shifted, flicking the cigarette into the dirt and grinding it beneath his boot. "You think I started this? You think this town didn't offer it up on a plate? The sheriff? The neighbors? Half of them looked the other way before we even stepped on the porch. We didn't force anything. We just walked through doors already open." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You want me to say it was wrong?" Clay asked, voice rising slightly. "Fine, it was wrong. It was cruel. But don't come here pretending I'm the only one who made this place rot. I didn't build the system. I used it." Ethan took one step forward, slow and final. Clay's face twitched, not fear, but awareness. "All right then," he muttered, tossing his jacket to the ground. "I guess we're past talking." Clay charged low, hoping to catch Ethan off balance, fists up, stance wild but practiced, like someone who'd survived more brawls than battles. Ethan didn't flinch. He pivoted hard to the left, his forearm catching Clay's neck, redirecting. The momentum passed him. Clay stumbled, caught himself, and spun back with a right hook meant to break bone. Ethan ducked it. His fist came up under Clay's ribs with a thud that knocked the air from his lungs. Before Clay could retreat, Ethan grabbed his collar, yanked him forward, and slammed his knee into Clay's gut with precision that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with training. Clay grunted, doubled over, and twisted violently, throwing Ethan off just enough to stagger him back a step. Clay lunged again, tackling Ethan around the waist, and they went down in a crash of limbs and dirt, fists flying, elbows landing wherever they could connect. Clay's knuckles grazed Ethan's jaw, but Ethan answered with a sharp strike to Clay's head that left him blinking. They rolled once, twice, each trying to gain the top position. Ethan broke free, rose first, chest heaving, sweat slicking his forehead. Clay scrambled up, spitting blood, a grin flickering like he still believed he could turn this. "You fight like a soldier," Clay said, circling, fists raised again. "But this ain't war. This is dirt. You bleed the same as any of us." Ethan didn't speak. He stepped forward. They met in the field center, the sun bleeding into the horizon, casting long shadows toward the house like ghosts reaching for something lost. Clay struck high, aiming for the face, but Ethan caught the wrist mid-swing, turned it outward, and slammed his palm against Clay's elbow in one clean motion that snapped the joint with a sound that ended whatever pride Clay had left. Clay screamed, tried to swing with the other hand, but Ethan ducked, twisted, and delivered a brutal strike to the base of Clay's spine that dropped him to one knee. Still, Clay fought. With his good arm, he surged upward, throwing a desperate punch that caught Ethan across the cheek, drawing blood. Ethan didn't blink. He grabbed Clay by the collar, lifted him off the ground, and drove him backward against the trunk of a low, twisted tree at the clearing's edge. Clay's head snapped back against the bark, dazed, and Ethan stepped back, waiting. Clay stumbled forward, body shaking, one arm limp, the other clutched across his ribs. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. "She wasn't supposed to die." Ethan no longer heard him. He was moving again. The second wind came not from strategy or strength, but from the place in his chest, where grief and rage collapsed into something sharper, something that didn't burn but cut. He watched Clay stagger, blood trailing from his mouth, one eye swelling, jaw purpling beneath the bone. Clay stayed on his feet, shoulders rising and falling, trying to square his stance, one arm limp, the other trembling in guard. "You think killing me fixes this?" Clay spat, slurring, barely standing. "You think this makes her come back?" Ethan didn't answer. He stepped in. The punch landed clean against Clay's ribs, followed instantly by an elbow across his temple, then a knee to the gut that forced the air from Clay's lungs in a soundless exhale. Clay dropped, but Ethan grabbed him mid-fall, drove him back against the tree, held him with one hand at his collar, and delivered another blow, then another, until Clay's legs gave way, his weight slumping into Ethan's chest. Ethan didn't let him fall. He shoved him backward, let him drop to the dirt in a heap, then circled slowly, breathing through his nose, blood dripping from his mouth, sweat streaking his brow, fists clenching and unclenching, not from hesitation, but from holding back the part of himself that wanted to end it now, to break something that could never be unbroken. Clay rolled onto his side, groaning. She wasn't supposed to be home. He muttered through broken teeth. "We were just gonna scare her, push her out, take the house. You know how many people just walk away when we lean hard enough?" Ethan was already there, crouched low, grabbing Clay's shirt and yanking him upright. "My mother didn't walk away from anything," he said, voice quiet, each syllable controlled like pressure building in a sealed room. "She stood her ground. You made sure that got her killed." Clay swung clumsily. A half punch meant more for pride than pain. Ethan deflected it easily, twisted his wrist, and slammed Clay's face back into the dirt. Clay cried out, muffled by earth, but Ethan didn't loosen his grip. He turned Clay over, drove his forearm into his chest, pinning him as his other hand landed 2 more strikes across the jaw, brutal, clean, unrelenting. Each impact echoed louder than the last. Ethan wasn't fighting a man anymore. He was fighting the night he didn't get to say goodbye. The image of her glasses cracked and tossed into a bin, the sound of her silence, her phone buzzing under the armchair, her hand too far to reach it. Clay's resistance broke, not just his strength, but the defiance in his eyes, the smugness that lingered even when his bones gave out. He sobbed now, whether from pain or realization. Ethan didn't. Kare. He released him with a final shove, letting Clay collapse onto his back, arms splayed, breath hitching in short gasps. The sun dropped lower, casting a wide band of orange across the field, making the blood on Clay's face gleam like rusted copper. Ethan stepped back, chest heaving, fists still clenched, body trembling, not from fatigue, but from the restraint it took not to end it. Clay turned his head, barely able to lift it. "I didn't kill her," he rasped. "I didn't go inside." Ethan had heard enough. He grabbed Clay's collar one last time, lifted him to his knees, and stared into the man's ruined face. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind through the field, the creak of the old house, and the faint whistle of birds retreating into the trees. Then Ethan leaned in, voice quiet, firm, final. "You sent them." With that, he drove, one last punch into Clay's temple, not wild with rage but weighted with certainty. Clay's body dropped limp, collapsing onto the grass like a man made hollow by his own sins. He didn't move again. Ethan stood over him, breath slowing, hands raw, muscles burning from the fight's length. There was no satisfaction in his face, no triumph. Only the stillness of a man who'd done what needed doing, not for revenge, but for balance, for dignity, for the name they tried to erase in silence. He didn't say a word as he turned away. He didn't look back. No speech, no eulogy, no final act to make it clean. Just a field, a broken man, and the weight of justice falling quiet at last. By the time the coroner's van rolled up the dirt, path toward the farmhouse behind Miller's Creek, Clay Barger's body had cooled beneath the shade of the gnarled tree where the final blow landed. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses willing to step forward, no statements placing Ethan Harris at the scene. The death wasn't ruled murder. Too many bruises on Clay's knuckles, too much blood spread between both men to suggest anything but a fight. Self-defense was whispered in the deputy's office. Quiet nods replaced formal charges. No one pressed for more. No one asked where Ethan had gone because they already knew, and none wanted to admit it. Back in town, the warehouse fire was officially an accident, though every deputy who read the report saw through it. Weeks later, when documentation surfaced, photographs of stolen items cataloged without police intervention, names tied to cash drops, files hidden beneath the sheriff's records, it became clear the rot wasn't just in the crew. It had seeped higher into the roots of the town itself. The photographs Ethan had taken from the sheriff's office, Eleanor's ignored complaints, the handwritten notes about strangers circling elderly homes, began to circulate, not through official channels but in quiet envelopes left at the doors of those who'd stayed silent too long. No names were signed, no threats made, just the weight of evidence that forced eyes to open. A deputy resigned within the month, citing personal reasons though. Whispers at the diner suggested he'd been seen shredding papers late at night. A councilman sold his house and left for a neighboring county, his departure abrupt, his excuses thin. The town didn't erupt, it shifted, like a house settling after a storm, cracks widening where trust once held. Ethan didn't stay to watch the fallout. He returned to the house one final time, not to mourn or reclaim, but to close what had been left open. The living room, still stripped of her presence, felt smaller now, the air heavy with the scent of dust and absence. He walked to the bedroom, opened the cedar trunk again and placed her glasses, cracked lens and all, beside the folded flag and letters. He didn't read them. They weren't his to claim. Instead, he took a single item, a small, tarnished cross she'd worn on Sundays, its chain thin but unbroken. He slipped it into his pocket, a quiet tether to the woman who'd raised him to stand when others fell. Outside, the yard was unchanged, the roses still gone, the gravel path worn but unyielding. He stood on the porch, one hand on the splintered rail, and looked out at the street where neighbors had once waved and now averted their eyes. The maple trees swayed gently, their leaves catching the late afternoon light. And for a moment, he could almost see her kneeling there, hands in the soil, coaxing life from stubborn earth. He didn't linger on the thought. He locked the door, left the key under the mat for whoever came next, and walked to his truck without looking back. The drive out of town was slow, deliberate, the F-150's engine humming low as the field stretched, wide on either side. He didn't head for the city or the coast, places where men like him might disappear into crowds or start over. He drove north, toward open land, where the horizon offered no promises, only space to carry what couldn't be left behind. The cross hung from the rearview mirror, swaying slightly with the truck's motion, catching glints of sunlight like a signal meant for no one but him. In the weeks that followed, stories began to form, not in newspapers or police logs, but in the quiet corners of bars, church basements, and back porches. A man who'd come home too late, a fire that burned too clean, a list of names no one dared speak aloud. Some called him a ghost, others a soldier, a few a devil sent to settle scores. But those who'd known Eleanor Harris, who'd seen her, tend her roses or leave pies on their steps, spoke of him differently. They called him her son, and in their voices was not fear, but a quiet respect for the justice she deserved, delivered not with noise, but with the steady hand of someone who'd learned silence could be louder than screams. Sheriff Colton never saw Ethan again, though he looked for him in every unmarked truck that passed through town, every shadow that lingered too long at dusk. The folder on Eleanor Harris's case stayed open on his desk, a reminder of what he'd failed to do, its pages yellowing with time. No new leads were added, no arrests made, but the complaints from elderly residents began to be logged with. Care followed up with calls, patrols, even visits. The town learned to listen, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. Somewhere far from Iowa's fields, Ethan stopped at a roadside diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted of yesterday. He sat by the window, the cross still hanging in his truck outside, and opened a small notebook. Not his mother's, but one he'd started in her honor. Its pages held no names now, only places. Towns like hers, small and overlooked, where silence hid the same rot he'd uncovered. He didn't write much, Just enough to mark the next stop, the next street, the next house where someone might be waiting for a knock that carried no ID. He paid for his coffee, left a tip that made the waitress pause, and stepped back into the morning light. The truck door closed with a soft thud. The engine turned over and he drove on. Not toward vengeance or redemption, but toward the work she'd taught him. To see what others ignored. To stand where others turned away. To carry the weight of the quiet ones until their voices could be heard again. And in the town he left behind, the roses never returned. But the maple trees stood taller, their branches reaching for a sky that seemed, at last, to hold a little more light.